Russia is waging a war against God.
When Stalin got into power, 130,000 Russian priests were arrested. 8,000 bishops and priests were murdered.
And this has not changed much since that. Russia today has much in common with Soviet Union.
I learned that politicizing and prosecuting Christians is nothing new for the Russian state. In fact, it's the exact playbook they have used for centuries.
In today's Russia, Protestant pastors are fined for gathering in prayer. Catholics have little freedom. And Jews are hunted down and shamed simply for practicing their traditions. Across the country, churches are raided mid-sermon, and Jewish communities that once thrived in cultural and religious autonomy have quietly faded, not from war or extremism, but from a government determined to crush independent faith. The Kremlin's campaign against religion doesn't discriminate. It targets anyone whose beliefs lead instead of follow. From underground churches to oppressed Jews, this is the story of the price of belief when the Kremlin demands silence. Let's start with the role of the Orthodox Church, because it's key to understanding all of this. For over 1,000 years, Orthodoxy had been part of what made Russia feel like Russia. It started back in 988 CE, when a prince named Vladimir picked Christianity for the people. He got baptized, and so did his kingdom, tying the church to the rulers. Over time, the church helped kings and tsars keep people united, especially during wars or tough times. It became a symbol of being Russian, like a flag or an anthem. If you were Orthodox, you were loyal to the land and its leaders. Today, that connection is super strong. The government, led by President Putin, works closely with the Orthodox Church. The church's leader, Patriarch Kirill, has called Putin's time in charge a gift to Russia, saying it in a public letter in 2023, celebrating their partnership. The government gives money to fix up old churches and monasteries, and in return, the church supports the state's big ideas, like promoting family values or standing up to the West. It's a deal that works for both sides. The church gets to be a big deal in schools and on TV, and the government gets to look like it's protecting Russia's soul. But what about Christians who aren't Orthodox? Well, that's where the trouble starts. Russia has always had other Christian groups, Protestants who have been around for centuries, but they've never quite belonged. They were tolerated at best, watched at worst, and often treated like outsiders in their own country. The first wave came with German settlers in the 1500s, mostly Lutherans, invited to help build and farm. Later, Mennonites arrived, fleeing persecution in Europe. They formed tight-knit communities in places like Ukraine and Siberia, known for their discipline, pacifism, and strong religious traditions. In the 1800s, Baptists began to spread, inspired by missionaries from Germany and Britain. Their message was simple but powerful. Faith should be personal, and baptism should be a choice made in adulthood. That idea clashed hard with the Orthodox view, and it made Baptists a target. Pentecostals followed in the early 1900s. They brought a more emotional style of worship that included praying out loud, singing with passion, and sometimes speaking in tongues. These groups were small, scattered, and often poor, but they were resilient. They held on to their beliefs even when the state, the church, and the culture pushed back. Under the Tsars, Protestants were always under pressure. The Orthodox Church was the only one officially recognized, and anything outside of it was seen as suspicious. If you were a Baptist, Lutheran, or Mennonite, it was bad. You could be denied permission to build a church, banned from printing religious texts, or fined for holding public meetings. What's worse is that trying to convert someone from Orthodoxy wasn't just frowned upon, it was illegal. Pastors were watched, sermons were censored, and believers were often forced to worship in private, knowing that one wrong move could bring the police to their door. Then came 1917. And things got much, much worse. The Bolsheviks didn't just dislike religion, they flat out hated it. They saw it as a threat to the revolution, a tool of oppression that needed to be destroyed. To this end, they did everything they could to crush it. Lenin called it a lie. Stalin treated it like a virus. All religious groups were targeted, but Protestants were especially vulnerable. They didn't have a central authority that the state could manipulate. They met in homes, forests, and small gatherings. That independence made them dangerous in the eyes of the regime. By the 1930s, the repression had turned into a purge. Thousands of Protestant pastors, elders, and missionaries were arrested and sent to forced labor camps in Siberia, the Arctic, and Central Asia. Many were never seen again. Churches were shut down or repurposed. Bibles were confiscated, burned, or hidden away. Religious literature was banned, and even owning a handwritten verse could be considered an anti-Soviet activity. While there's no single Soviet report that officially states it, historians estimate that more than 80% of religious leaders, including Protestants, were either imprisoned, executed, or forced into silence during the height of Stalin's terror. And yet, the faith didn't die. It just went underground. Protestants continued to meet in secret, sometimes in barns, basements, or deep in the woods. They passed around handwritten copies of scripture, memorized verses, and taught their children quietly at home. Families prayed in whispers, always listening for footsteps outside. The fear was constant, but so was the conviction. For many, faith became not just spiritual, it became resistance. In 1944, the Soviet government tried a new tactic. It allowed the formation of the All-Union Council of Evangelical Christian Baptists. This was done in the hopes of controlling the movement by giving it an official structure. Some churches joined, hoping to survive. Others, they refused, unwilling to compromise their independence. Those who stayed outside the system faced even more pressure, like raids, arrests, and harassment. But they held their ground. Their faith wasn't just about belief. It was about freedom. And no matter how hard the government tried to stamp it out, it kept burning. Quietly, stubbornly, like a fire that refused to die. When the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991, things looked up for a bit. The 1990s were a wild time in Russia, giving birth to new ideas and new freedoms. Protestant churches started growing fast. Missionaries from places like America and Europe came over, bringing money and Bibles. New churches reopened, and people curious about faith filled them up. By the early 2000s, about 1 million Russians called themselves Protestants, with Baptists making up the biggest chunk, about 500,000. Pentecostals weren't far behind, maybe 300,000. Adventists built schools and clinics, helped communities, and they spread their message. It felt like a moment when faith could finally be free. However, that didn't last. When Vladimir Putin took over in 2000, the atmosphere around religion began to shift. The Russian Orthodox Church was elevated as a symbol of national identity, while other Christian groups, especially Protestants, started looking like outsiders. Many Protestant churches had ties to the West, with pastors trained abroad, funding from foreign missions, and theology that didn't line up with state-approved narratives. To the Kremlin, this wasn't just inconvenient, it was suspicious. Anything foreign was now seen as a potential threat, a doorway for influence, or even a cover for espionage. By the mid-2000s, the message was clear. The state wanted tighter control over religion. Laws became more restrictive, registration requirements more complicated, and surveillance more aggressive. Independent churches were pressured to join official unions or risk being labeled extremist. Evangelicalism, outside of designated spaces, was discouraged. And while Orthodox institutions flourished with state backing, Protestant groups found themselves boxed in, legally, socially, and financially. The real turning point came in 2016 with the introduction of the Yarovaya Law. Named after politician Irina Yarovaya, the law was officially framed as an anti-terrorism measure. But for religious minorities, it felt like a crackdown in disguise. The law made it illegal to share your faith outside of a registered religious building. That meant no Bible studies at home, no street preaching, no handing out tracts, and no posting about your beliefs online unless you had government approval. Even inviting someone to church could be considered illegal missionary activity. The penalties were steep. Individuals could be fined 5,000 rubles, about $75, just for talking about their faith in public. Churches and organizations face fines up to 1 million rubles, roughly $12,000, for holding unauthorized meetings or displaying signs that invited outsiders to worship. That's not just a slap on the wrist. For small congregations already struggling to survive, it's enough to shut them down completely. And the law wasn't just symbolic, it was enforced. Baptist pastors were charged for having signs outside of their buildings. Pentecostal believers were fined for discussing their faith at bus stops. Worship services were interrupted mid-sermon. Even online posts about prayer meetings were flagged as violations. By 2019, more than half of all the cases prosecuted under the Yarovaya Law involved evangelical Christians. The impact was chilling for Protestants. Churches stopped advertising services. Believers grew afraid to speak openly. Missionary work slowed to a crawl. And in a country where the Orthodox Church enjoys state protection, Protestants were left navigating a legal minefield just to practice their faith. Police began to show up at prayer meetings, sometimes breaking them up and taking people's books or phones. The Yarovaya Law didn't just regulate religion, it redefined it. It drew a line between what was Russian and what was foreign, and made sure that anything outside the state's control stayed quiet or paid the price. The Jehovah's Witnesses have faced the harshest treatment of any Christian group in Russia. In 2017, the government officially labeled them as extremists. That shocked many people because these are peaceful Christians who don't fight in wars and are mostly known for going door to door to talk about their faith. You've probably had a run-in with them yourself, but the Russian authorities saw their independence, global connections, and refusal to follow state rules as a threat. They were banned completely. Their literature was outlawed, their worship criminalized, and their buildings taken. Some of their properties were worth millions. As of August of this year, 157 Jehovah's Witnesses are still in prison. Some are serving sentences as long as 8 years, just for holding prayer meetings or reading the Bible together. In one case from 2024, a family in the Urals temporarily lost custody of their children because officials claimed their beliefs were harmful. These kinds of actions send a clear message to other religious groups. Step out of line, and you'll pay the price. A recent report from Open Doors, a group that tracks religious persecution, shows that Russia has become one of the hardest places for Protestants to practice freely. So has the world just looked on as all of this has been happening? Well, yes and no. You see, the international response has been strong, but not very effective. The United States, the European Union, and several human rights organizations have repeatedly called out Russia for religious discrimination. In 2024, the US State Department kept Russia on a list of countries of particular concern for the 6th year in a row. They say Russia was targeting Protestants with systematic oppression. Groups like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have published reports showing how Protestant communities are monitored, harassed, and jailed for basic religious activities. Churches in the West, including the Southern Baptist Convention and the United Methodist Church, have spoken out too. They've written letters, organized prayer campaigns, and urged their governments to take action. But inside Russia, little has changed. Officials dismiss the criticism as foreign interference, and because Protestants are a small minority, their voices often go unheard. Things are even worse in parts of Ukraine that Russia now controls. Since the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the invasion of eastern Ukraine in 2022, Protestant churches in those areas have been under serious threat. In places like Donetsk and Luhansk, over 100 Protestant buildings have been taken and handed over to Orthodox groups that support Moscow. Pastors who refuse to cooperate are arrested. Some have been tortured. Others have been killed. One Baptist leader in Donetsk was beaten for refusing to pledge loyalty to Russia. In Crimea, early cases under the Yarovaya law turned into full bans. Protestant worship is now treated as a form of resistance. Human Rights Watch says these regions have become black holes for religious freedom, where appeals are impossible and silence is the only way to stay safe. Still, Protestants continue to hold on. Just like during Soviet times, many have gone underground. They use encrypted apps, quiet gatherings, and coded messages to stay connected. Some have left Russia for places like Poland or Germany, where they can worship freely. But many have stayed, choosing to live with the risk rather than abandon their communities. Their faith is strong, but quiet. It's not about making noise, it's about surviving. However, what's interesting is that not everyone is just going with the flow. Even inside the Russian Orthodox Church, which most people assume always supports the government, not everyone agrees with the state's actions. Some priests and bishops have spoken out, especially since the Ukraine war began. In 2022, more than 280 Orthodox clerics from different countries signed an open letter condemning the war. They said it went against Christian values. Some of them were based in Russia or had Russian congregations. Others, like Father Loan Berdin from Kostroma, used their sermons to speak against violence. He was fined for it. Another priest, Father Dmitry Safronov, lost his job after posting a message online that criticized the war, and earlier having presided over the funeral of Russia's opposition party. These men aren't famous, but their words mattered to their followers. They showed that even inside of the Orthodox Church, there are people who believe faith should lead the state, not follow it. Though it is true that most Orthodox leaders stay silent or support the government, the cracks are there, and they're growing. In today's Russia, religion is no longer just about belief, it's about control. The state decides which faiths are safe, which voices are allowed, and which prayers are permitted. Those who step outside the lines, whether they're Jehovah's Witnesses, Baptists, or Orthodox priests, face consequences. But they also carry something the government can't crush: conviction. And in a country where silence is often the only protection, conviction becomes a quiet form of resistance. But it's not just the Protestants that have suffered persecution. Two of the oldest religious groups in Russia that have also suffered greatly, Catholics and Jews. Both have deep roots in Russian lands, and both have faced centuries of discrimination, violence, and control. Just like with the Protestants, their stories show us how Russia treats any faith that doesn't follow the rules set by the state. Let's start with the Jewish community. Jews have lived in parts of Russia for more than 1,000 years, but for most of that time, they weren't treated as equal citizens. In the Russian Empire, Jews were forced to live in special areas called the Pale of Settlement. They weren't allowed to live in big cities like Moscow or St. Petersburg, and many faced legal limits on jobs, education, and even property. They were also the targets of something called pogroms. These were violent acts that destroyed homes and businesses and often killed innocent people. Many of these pogroms were not random. Local officials and police often encouraged them or looked the other way. By the late 1800s, anti-Semitism in Russia was becoming part of government policy. The secret police helped spread a fake document called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which claimed Jews were planning to take over the world. It was complete fiction, but it was used to justify hatred and suspicion. and it would go on to inspire Nazi propaganda later. But when the Soviet Union was formed, things didn't get better. At first, the new government said it would treat all people equally, but soon it began attacking religion across the board, and that included Judaism. Synagogues were closed, Hebrew was banned, Jewish schools and newspapers were shut down, Jewish leaders were arrested or executed, and many Jews were forced to give up their faith or hide it to survive. Under Stalin, anti-Semitism reached terrifying levels. In 1952, 3 Jewish poets and writers were executed in secret during what became known as the Night of the Murdered Poets. Just a year later, Stalin accused a group of Jewish doctors of plotting to kill Soviet leaders. This fabrication was called the Doctors' Plot. Many Jews feared mass arrests were coming, but fortunately, Stalin died before that could happen. Unfortunately, even after Stalin, things were still hard. Jews were often denied university admission, blocked from certain jobs, or not allowed to travel abroad. Those who applied to leave the Soviet Union were called refusniks. They lost their jobs, were watched by the KGB, and sometimes arrested just for asking to leave. Practicing Judaism openly remained dangerous. However, much like what happened to the Protestants, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Jewish life started to return. Synagogues reopened, and Hebrew classes started again. Jewish organizations from around the world came together and helped to rebuild communities. For a while, it seemed like Jewish life in Russia had a future. But as you probably guessed, starting in the 2000s, things began to change. As Putin tightened control over society, anti-Semitic ideas slowly came back. Far-right groups spread old conspiracy theories. State media would sometimes hint that Jews were behind Russia's problems. In January of 2017, Peter Tolstoy, a senior Russian lawmaker and deputy speaker of the State Duma, made remarks suggesting that descendants of Jews who jumped out of the Pale of Settlement and pulled down our churches during the Bolshevik Revolution were now running non-governmental organizations in Russia. Many saw this as a clear anti-Semitic message, but in Putin's Russia, he faced no punishment. After Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the situation got worse. Even though Ukraine's president is Jewish, Russian propaganda claimed that the Ukrainian government was full of Nazis. In 2023, a synagogue in Moscow was defaced with hate-filled graffiti, symbols that carried a clear message of intimidation. It wasn't just vandalism, it was a warning. Then, in 2024, a Jewish school in Volgograd shut its doors after being targeted by repeated bomb threats. The threats kept coming, and no one was ever held accountable. The authorities offered no protection, no answers, and no arrests. For many Jewish families, it was the breaking point. Parents began pulling their children out of religious schools, fearing for their safety. Some Jewish leaders quietly left the country, unwilling to risk their communities any longer. But what truly shook the nation came in October of 2023. A flight from Tel Aviv landed in Dagestan, and within hours, a mob stormed Uitash Airport in Makhachkala. They weren't just protesting, they were hunting. Hundreds of people broke through barriers, waving Palestinian flags, shouting threats, and demanding to see passports. They were looking for Jewish passengers. Some chased people across the tarmac. Others tried to block the plane from landing. It was raw, targeted hatred, broadcast live on social media. The police response was slow and weak. Only a handful of arrests were made, and most of the rioters walked free. That weekend, similar scenes played out across the North Caucasus. In Nalchik, a Jewish cultural center under construction, was set on fire. In Kasavkhirt, protesters threw stones at a hotel they believed was housing Israeli refugees. In Cherkessk, crowds rallied, demanding the eviction of ethnic Jews. It wasn't isolated, it was coordinated, and it was tolerated. Jewish leaders across Russia saw it for what it was: a breakdown of public safety, a moment when the mask slipped and the danger became undeniable. The government denied responsibility, blaming provocateurs and foreign influence. But the message was clear. Being visibly Jewish in Russia had become a risk. The fear was no longer theoretical, it was real, and it was growing. These events didn't happen in isolation. They followed years of rising anti-Semitism, fueled by conspiracy theories and nationalistic rhetoric. Jewish organizations were already under pressure, and some were labeled as foreign agents. Others faced surprise inspections, legal threats, and smear campaigns. Online hate speech targeting Jews was rarely punished. Vandalism of synagogues and cemeteries was brushed aside. The state didn't need to lead the attacks. They just needed to look the other way. For many Jewish families, the decision to leave wasn't about politics. It was about survival. The airport riot was a turning point. It showed that mobs could act with impunity, that police would hesitate, and that the government would deflect. It showed that the old fears were back, and this time they were being ignored by the very institutions meant to protect. The silence from the Kremlin was deafening. No national address, no apology, No real crackdown, just vague statements and a few arrests. That silence spoke volumes. It told Jewish communities that they were on their own, and it told the rest of Russia that anti-Semitism was no longer taboo. It was just another tool in the state's arsenal. Now, let's look at the Catholic Church, another religious group that's often seen in Russia as foreign or even suspicious. Catholics have lived in Russian territory for hundreds of years, especially in areas like Western Ukraine, Belarus, and parts of Siberia, where there are Polish or Lithuanian roots. But from the beginning, the Russian government and the Orthodox Church saw Catholicism as a rival. In the 1700s and 1800s, when Poland was divided and absorbed into the Russian Empire, millions of Catholics suddenly became Russian subjects. The state responded by limiting Catholic worship, banning some church activities, and pushing people to convert to Orthodoxy. Jesuit missionaries were expelled. Priests were monitored or arrested. Catholicism was allowed, but only under strict control. Under the Soviets, it got even worse. The communist government treated Catholicism the same way it treated any other religion, as a threat. Churches were closed, priests were arrested, and monasteries were destroyed or turned into prisons. In 1937, during Stalin's Great Terror, Catholic clergy in Ukraine and Belarus were targeted, accused of spying or spreading anti-Soviet ideas. Many were sent to labor camps or executed. Even after Stalin, the Catholic Church remained under pressure. The Soviet government saw the Vatican as a dangerous foreign power, and being Catholic was viewed as suspicious. Religious education had to happen in secret. Priests even had to choose between cooperating with the government or risking arrest. However, things changed briefly in the 1990s. After the fall of the USSR, Catholics began rebuilding. The Vatican opened diplomatic relations, new bishops were appointed, and churches reopened. Assistance even flooded in as foreign priests and charities came to help. For a short time, there was hope. That was until 2002, when Pope John Paul II made a bold move to strengthen the Catholic Church's presence in Russia by elevating 4 apostolic administrations into full dioceses: Moscow, Saratov, Novosibirsk, and Irkutsk. That decision didn't really sit well with the Russian Orthodox Church. Orthodox leaders accused the Vatican of trying to carve out a rival church on Russian soil, calling it an invasion, and warning that Catholic expansion threatened Russia's spiritual sovereignty. The Kremlin quickly sided with the Orthodox hierarchy, reinforcing the idea that Catholicism was a foreign influence. From that moment, Catholic growth stalled. Foreign priests faced visa denials, parishes struggled with registration, and Catholic outreach was quietly restricted. The pressure didn't just return, it became policy. Today's Catholic groups in Russia face many of the same restrictions as Protestants and Jews. Foreign priests still get denied visas, while Catholic charities are labeled foreign agents. Schools and youth programs are often inspected or blocked. In one 2021 case, a priest in Vladivostok was detained for giving religious lessons without special permission. No charges were filed, but it sent a clear message: you're being watched. Some of the worst pressure came after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Catholic leaders across Europe and even within Russia called for peace. A few priests spoke out publicly against the war. In response, their churches were targeted. One priest in Kaliningrad was removed from his church after preaching against violence. Soon after, his parish was raided by tax police. Others have been fined under Russia's new laws that bans disrespecting the military. Catholics now find themselves in a dangerous spot. They are seen as Western, and their values are viewed as suspicious. Even celebrating Christmas on December 25th, which is common in most of the Catholic world, makes them stand out in a country where the Orthodox Church celebrates in January. In schools, Catholic students often face pressure to conform, and Catholic voices are left out of public discussions about religion. The Vatican has tried to keep peace with the Russian government and the Orthodox Church. In 2023, Pope Francis offered to help mediate the war in Ukraine and sent a message of peace. The Kremlin ignored it. Russian Orthodox leaders called it interference. Inside Russia, many Catholic leaders now keep quiet, focusing on survival instead of protest. The persecution of Catholics, Protestants, and Jews in Russia is not random. It is part of a larger design. Each community faces a different method of control, but the purpose is always the same. Protestants are fined, harassed, and raided for something as small as a house prayer. Catholics are quietly suffocated through bureaucracy, endless paperwork, and intimidation. Jewish communities, especially those asserting cultural or religious independence, are watched, isolated, and often treated as a danger to national unity. The tools vary, but the logic does not. The state cannot allow faith to exist outside of its grip. To understand this better, you have to look at the broader pattern. In Russia, religion is tolerated only when it reinforces the political order. The Russian Orthodox Church is the perfect example. It is deeply woven into national identity, stands shoulder to shoulder with the Kremlin, and rarely challenges authority. It is not simply a religious institution, but a political partner. By contrast, Protestants are seen as a Western import. Their decentralized structure makes them hard to control, which is why the state marginalizes them. Catholics, with their global connections and centuries of independence from Russian power, are regarded with suspicion. Jews, with distinct traditions and long histories of resilience, are viewed as permanent outsiders who can never fully be trusted. This pattern stretches back centuries. Under the Tsars, the Orthodox Church acted almost like a government ministry. Under the Soviets, religion was nearly erased through blunt force persecution. Under Putin, the methods are more subtle, but the principle has not changed. Faith is tolerated only when it strengthens the state. Anything else is punished. And this is not just theory. Modern data backs it up. Freedom House documented over 600 cases of harassment or arrests in just 1 year, overwhelmingly against non-Orthodox believers. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom places Russia in the highest category of concern, citing systemic violations against Protestants, Catholics, Jews, and other minorities. For underground Catholic parishes, small Protestant house churches, and Jewish cultural centers, these numbers are not abstract. They are a lived reality. Here is where the contradiction sharpens. Russia's constitution guarantees freedom of religion. The 1997 religion law claims to protect minority groups. On paper, every community should be able to worship without fear. But in practice, those same laws are turned into weapons. Paperwork becomes a trap. Registration rules become tools of exclusion. Faith groups are labeled extremist, not because they are violent, but because they refuse to submit. From the outside, it looks like the system is broken, but in reality, it's working exactly as intended. It creates the appearance of freedom while ensuring that only loyal and compliant faiths survive. But while Protestants and Catholics struggle under constant pressure, something very different is happening in Russia's Muslim regions. In places like Dagestan, Chechnya, and Tartarstan, Islamic institutions have not only survived, but expanded. Sharia-based courts resolve disputes. Madrasas openly train new generations of imams and scholars. Islamic banks move billions of rubles through systems that reject interest and instead use faith-based financial models. Cultural centers and mosques shape the daily rhythm of life. Dagestan shows this clearly. Many locals prefer Sharia-based courts over Moscow's legal system. These courts are not formally recognized, but their rulings on marriage, inheritance, or land disputes carry real weight. People follow them because they see them as just and aligned with local traditions. In Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov has gone even further. Public life is infused with Islamic values. Schools encourage religious dress. Alcohol sales are restricted. Public events often begin with prayer, and clerics wield enormous influence. The Kremlin does not resist this arrangement because it guarantees stability and loyalty in a volatile region. This pattern extends beyond the Caucasus. In Tartarstan and Bashkortostan, Islamic academies operate with local government support and enroll hundreds of students. Financial systems built on Islamic principles thrive, offering banking that aligns with faith while fueling local economies. Even far from these regions, in Moscow, Siberia, and in small towns across Russia, mosques are built, halal shops multiply, and Islamic cultural centers take root. Migrants from Central Asia fuel this growth, making Islam more visible across the country. So why does the state suffocate small Protestant prayer groups while allowing Islamic courts and banks to operate openly? The reasons lie partially in history and demographics. In regions like Dagestan and Tartarstan, Islam is not seen as foreign. It is a native religion, deeply tied to identity, and therefore easier for the state to tolerate when it helps maintain order. Protestants, by contrast, are branded as outsiders, too closely tied to the West, too independent to control. Structure plays a role as well. Islamic institutions are often centralized, linked to clerical bodies that the Kremlin can monitor and influence. They are predictable and willing to cooperate with local authorities. Protestant churches, by contrast, are decentralized and grassroots. Their autonomy makes them unpredictable, which in Moscow's eyes makes them dangerous. But it would be a mistake to think Muslims in Russia are truly free. Their space to operate exists only within strict limits. When they move beyond what the Kremlin considers acceptable, the backlash is immediate. In the 1990s, Salafi villages in Dagestan attempted to declare independence and enforce full Sharia law. Moscow responded with tanks and airstrikes, crushing them completely. Independent mosques are still watched closely, and religious leaders who step out of line risk arrest. The freedom is real, but it is fragile. Even with these limits, the contrast remains stark. A Protestant family can be fined for gathering in a living room. A Catholic parish can be buried under red tape. A Jewish cultural center can be monitored into silence. Meanwhile, in Chechnya or Dagestan, entire systems of Islamic law and finance operate with quiet approval. This is the heart of the story. Religion in Russia is not judged on its beliefs. It's judged on its usefulness to the state. If it stabilizes a region or strengthens the Kremlin's authority, it is allowed to grow. If it resists, It is treated as a threat. The Orthodox Church is elevated as a symbol of national identity. Islam is tolerated when it keeps the peace. Protestants, Catholics, and Jews are forced to the margins, painted as foreign, extremist, or dangerous. The result is a religious landscape that appears diverse but is tightly managed. Russia does not simply repress religion, it bends it, it manipulates it. It allows some faiths to flourish and strangles others into silence. The message is unmissable. In Russia, religion survives only if it serves. And for millions of believers who refuse to bow, the price of faith is surveillance, punishment, or erasure. Thanks for watching.